Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So I have the dubious distinction of being the bridge session. The bridge session meaning that I stand before you in lunch. In addition to that, I also am really talking in this session to really address SharePoint, not really focusing on a specific version, although I will call out some version-specific capabilities as it relates to development. But I really want to stay SharePoint agnostic or version agnostic and really the things I want to cover. As Ryan alluded to, I've been working in our public sector team for a number of years now. But those of you who know me and have seen me present before, I get pretty passionate about SharePoint. I've been working with SharePoint now since 1999 when the product was codenamed Tahoe. So I've seen the generations of SharePoint. I've gone through the pain. By show of hands, how many people remember the web storage system that shipped with SharePoint 2001? Our evil attempt at an object-oriented data store that SharePoint was going to sit on top of and be this rich structure at which you would go and query and get information into and out of a SharePoint deployment. Well, I've gone through those pains, and the infamous M drive, for those of you who are familiar with SharePoint. So I've really seen the product evolve into what it's become today as it relates to SharePoint Server 2007, as well as where it's going with SharePoint 2010. I guarantee you guys are going to be pleasantly surprised at the capabilities that are going to be made available in the platform in the 2010 timeframe. But then again, there's a lot of capabilities from a SharePoint Server 2007 perspective that you can take advantage of from a development standpoint for building very robust enterprise-level capabilities within your enterprise, as well as exposing capabilities on the public web for visitors who are visiting your site and taking advantage of capabilities and services you provide. So I'm going to jump really quickly into some of the things we're going to cover in this particular talk. We're going to cover the SharePoint vision. Jay sort of alluded to in the keynote presentation around some of the premises behind SharePoint, some of the core areas of focus. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, a little bit more detail. And then I'm going to talk specifically about capabilities for the enterprise as it relates to development using SharePoint as an application development platform, addressing a number of different areas around workflow, a lot of business systems integration, electronic forms, moving to that paperless enterprise. Talk a little bit about the business intelligence capability that's available in the product today, capability that you can take advantage of to deliver compelling solutions, both from an enterprise perspective as well as on the public web. Also talk about enterprise search and a lot of the capabilities that you can take advantage of from a development standpoint. Search is more than just querying for whatever content type that fits in your organization. You can actually leverage search as an application development platform to deliver more compelling capabilities through your enterprise and public web solutions. I'll talk a little bit about development environment considerations, some things you may want to think about as you're planning out a SharePoint development environment. I'm not going to go too deep because I know that there are some sessions in the afternoon that are going to talk a little bit more around the integrated experience from a Visual Studio to SharePoint perspective, but I'll talk a little bit more about just the environment, things you may want to consider, either from a SharePoint 2007 implementation today or a SharePoint 2010 implementation tomorrow. I'll round out with discussion around SharePoint on the web. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of projects that are near and dear to my heart, some opportunities that I've been working on with some customers, some of which are present out in the audience today, and really talk about SharePoint as a platform for delivering very compelling internet-facing websites. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about some of these projects and some of the things and capabilities that they're introducing. So looking at the SharePoint technology vision, it's evolved over quite a few number of years. It originally started out as this work group, level platform where you have 2 or 3 individuals who need to share some content, share key IP in order to make business decisions within this work group level infrastructure. Not a whole lot of investment as it relates to having a rich, robust application platform upon which to develop on. The technologies at its time were a little bit more progressive than most. It was, during the dawn of the web storage system and the Microsoft data engine. We've introduced this technology called SharePoint Team Services that provides a lot of this work group level capability. had a lot to be desired as it relates to delivering or providing a platform upon which you can deliver very compelling user experiences and a lot of business applications, but it was definitely a leap forward as it relates to really bridging the collaborative gap that exists between information workers within the enterprise. From a user experience perspective, it wasn't compelling. However, it did introduce some fairly innovative means for being able to show information, aggregated information to users. Now, by show of hands and virtual hands for those who are on the live meeting, how many of you guys have ever heard of digital dashboards? See, I'm really showing my age, and everybody here is showing their age as well. Digital dashboards was sort of the precursor to web parts. And it provided the ability to create this aggregated view of information that's coming from disparate data sources, okay, be they a lot of business databases, be they other applications, or be they SharePoint itself, and basically have this information aggregated up into this rich dashboard display that was typically shown through a rich client or a thick client like Outlook. But you also have the ability of showing this type of dashboard interface and these dashboard parts via the Internet Explorer web browser. Well, if you think about, what that was back in the day as we compare it to now in terms of the developer capability and the evolution of that technology, we've really come, full circle as it relates to, or maybe made leaps and bounds as it relates to how we've taken the concept of information or data visualization and have evolved it over time to really showcase building line of business applications that's interrogating, your favorite line of business application of choice, be it a custom off-the-shelf or a commercial off-the-shelf product like an SAP or whatever your ERP system that you're using internally, or a custom application that you've developed that may be on a Microsoft platform, maybe on a non-Microsoft platform, and basically utilizing the whole concept of web parts in this visualization as that aggregator of information. So you have that one executive dashboard that sits in front of your information workers and provides that window to the world being your enterprise infrastructure. Well, looking at the evolution of how SharePoint has gone from that work group level platform, it's moved into the department level where you now have business units that are working inside of an enterprise that are now trying to build upon and are introducing more demands as it relates to information sharing and collaboration. How do I get access to key intellectual property that's being created by other business units within my organization? How do I share and provide that content securely across those boundaries so that people who are in organization subunit B in my org, may or may not have access to content that's sitting in my team's work stream? So these are capabilities that have been made available from the SharePoint platform that we as developers can tie into as it relates to how we expose capabilities in the custom solutions that we deliver through SharePoint. And then moving forward and to the enterprise level, now we've introduced even more demands on top of SharePoint as it relates to now information discovery across the enterprise. And now I have information that may be sitting on file servers. I have information that are sitting in ODBC compliant databases. I have information that's sitting in key line of business applications that may or may not be exposed via web services. So how do I now envision that data and realize and visualize that information inside of a unified platform so that I can keep users and tools in which they're most familiar? One of the biggest challenges that we're facing in enterprise today is we're constantly standing up new application UI whenever we have a new requirement that, of course, that needs to be met for an end user to basically perform their day-to-day business tasks. One of the big premises around SharePoint as a platform is utilizing that as the core application platform for delivering this capability. So no more are you now subjected to introducing multiple application UI, some of which are doing the same thing, some of which are just, from the pure desire of the developer to create the next killer web application or the next killer Windows client application or whatever platform you're developing for. Now you have a platform from a SharePoint perspective that basically provides that unification model that allows you to deliver that capability in one sitting. And then lastly, moving beyond the enterprise, and now we're talking about the Internet. So the public web has now become our application development platform for the foreseeable future. And now we're looking to figure out how to address the key challenges that the users are facing over the web for accessing web applications, accessing capabilities of being web applications, but at the same time trying to find a unifying platform that allows you to deliver these capabilities without, again, having to reinvent the wheel, without having to think about, well, what does my deployment topology look like? How do I secure my infrastructure? How do I go about provisioning users in my system? How do I manage the users that exist in my system? A lot of these are key challenges that we're facing as it relates to delivering Internet capability through our web applications, regardless of the platform that we're implementing on. SharePoint as that application platform is really geared at providing capabilities, providing facilities that address those key challenges as it relates to delivering that capability over the web. So, very busy slide here, but essentially what this is pretty much entailing, this is what you're getting out of the box from a SharePoint perspective, okay? There's a lot of core capabilities in the SharePoint platform that I think by and large we only truly scratch the surface of maybe about 5% of the capability. There's a lot of thought that's going into the platform as it relates to some of the key challenges that we face in delivering enterprise-level web application and services to our constituents. From the perspective of collaboration, being able to provide robust infrastructure that allows information workers to share key business intellectual property across the team, across the org, across the entire enterprise. The ability for integrating the key line of business applications from a business process management perspective. One of the key challenges, and I've seen it time and time again, of custom workflow implementation, some custom rules engine, custom BPM processes that have gone into play. Be they elaborate as they are, they've also introduced a slight churn as it relates, or a big churn as it relates to constantly reproducing these types of capabilities whenever some new business requirement comes into play. And then on top of that, trying to maintain that type of infrastructure moving forward over versions of the application as the changing business requirements come in, as more and more demands from the end user in terms of end user productivity, the ease of use, the ability to integrate in tools and environments in which they're most familiar. These are key challenges that we're facing in delivering this type of capability into our environment. And what you're seeing from a SharePoint perspective is that a lot of thought is going into building this type of capability so you get a lot of those questions answered out of the box. Now let me take a pause a minute and really, put SharePoint, at the forefront and really talk about some of the big misconceptions from a SharePoint perspective. One of the big challenges when people look at SharePoint now, they look at it as this big platform that's very difficult to set up, install, and configure. There's a ton of options that you have to tweak in order to get the most efficient implementation of SharePoint. A lot of people complain regarding server requirements. A lot of people complain regarding integration with the development environment. At the end of the day, SharePoint is just ASP.NET application, okay? Deployment topology aside, it is purely an ASP.NET application that can be further extended through tools like Visual Studio and SharePoint Design. So that's point number one. Point number two is SharePoint was originally built not with an application developer in mind, but to be a turnkey solution that you can implement within your environment and get instant collaboration, instant workflow, instant data integration, a lot of the capabilities that a lot of end users are asking for, giving it to you out of the box. So from a development perspective, we coming from a ASP.NET or a classic ASP or PHP development plan, we look at SharePoint, we go, that's not flexible. Well, SharePoint really wasn't architected to be that level, that flexible component initially, or application platform initially, because again, it was really geared at a different audience. But over the time that SharePoint has been used in enterprises, we put more and more demands on the platform, more so from the community at large who are then taking SharePoint, deploying it in environments, and trying to figure out how to make things work or to deliver additional capability. But then the end users themselves are seeing the value from a SharePoint perspective, and they're asking for more. They're making more demands. So as the product has evolved, we've introduced more capabilities, and as Jay alluded to in the keynote, we're really trying to make our tooling catch up to the platform, because the platform has really become one of the hottest products that Microsoft sells. But it's really not been a success for Microsoft. It's been the success of SharePoint has really been fueled by each and every one of you guys. The community contribution from a SharePoint perspective has been astronomical. There's not been a lot of development, capabilities that have been introduced from a Microsoft perspective. A lot of those capabilities have been introduced through the community. A lot of the things that you see in SharePoint now, some developer sitting out in the wild had this wonderful idea to build a capability and publish it. You got people in product groups back in Reddit that are looking at that and they're like, hey, that's kind of cool. Maybe we should build that into our tool. No, we're not trying to compete with that person, but we're trying to learn from the community and figure out what does the community need as it relates to SharePoint development so that we can then build that capability into the platform. So that rather than you going out and installing another add-in and having to manage that and track down a developer who may or may not be working on projects anymore, you now have the capability built into the platform that you can take advantage of and deliver through tools like Visual Studio. From a SharePoint, from an application platform perspective, in addition to all the capabilities SharePoint all up, you're getting Windows Server, you're getting SQL Server, you're getting all the capabilities that you would have typically taken advantage of if you're developing on a Microsoft platform, delivering web or Windows client applications or a non-Microsoft application that may be taking advantage of core services that are afforded through the application platform. And you can extend that capability, and SharePoint takes advantage of that capability and extends that and provides a robust application infrastructure that you can then start developing and delivering key business capability on a unified platform. And then at the bottom of this particular slide, the opportunity for SharePoint integration are now in. It's bottomless, really. At this point, we're talking about integrating key line of business applications. Third-party products that are coming in market today are announcing capabilities that integrate with SharePoint. A lot of organizations, a lot of companies, a lot of our partners are really seeing the value of having a unifying platform that ties together all of the application components that we've delivered over in the market. Whether it's Microsoft, whether it's a competing or competitor of Microsoft, we work closely with competitors for delivering this type of capability because, again, a lot of people are seeing the value. And then there's the cloud. We're looking at taking advantage of cloud computing and moving to the next level of the types of applications that we deliver. SharePoint is positioned for that. Now, is SharePoint going to live in the cloud? Absolutely. We're working on that as we speak. There are a number of services that we offer from a Microsoft perspective through SharePoint Online that's going to allow hosted versions of SharePoint and delivering that web capability to organizations who may not necessarily have the infrastructure to host SharePoint internally. And we're going to take advantage of it as we evolve our cloud computing story. SharePoint is going to be a core part of that story as we move forward. So you look at SharePoint applications, and I essentially put them into three buckets. Now, the slide that Dave showed in the keynote sort of shows the virtual SharePoint donut that showed all these capabilities. But I collapsed that donut down into basically three different areas. You have people-centric applications that, again, users, information workers that are working within their environment, that wanted to stay in tools in which they're most familiar. There are a number of projects that I've worked on in my career where organizations who are trying to adopt SharePoint, the first thing that they say is, well, I like to live in Outlook. My entire day revolves around Outlook. How are you going to make this? How are you going to show that we add value by implementing SharePoint to my Outlook experience? That's one of the core focuses from a SharePoint platform perspective, and that is integration with Office. Again, keeping users in tools in which they're most familiar. One of the biggest challenges that I've seen from an application development perspective is that as developers, we just love cranking out code. We love introducing new APIs, new frameworks, new UI. We just love it. Hey, one of the big challenges with that is how do you go about maintaining that? How do you go about creating a consistent user experience across the application that you deliver? And then we often, more times than not, we often ignore the fact that Office is a development platform itself. So imagine being able to deliver all the compelling UI, taking advantage of really dynamic technology that is shipped today, and have it all fit within the context of Word or within the context of Outlook. So people-centric applications from a SharePoint perspective is really trying to focus around that concept. We call that concept Office Business Application, which you have these apps that are sitting inside of Office that take advantage of services and capabilities provided by the application platform, which is SharePoint, to then provide hooks into various services, be they on-premise or cloud-based, so that the user is completely transparent. They're just firing up their Word doc, and they get this nice little task pane that shows up on the side. Unbeknownst to them, that this task pane is querying information from SharePoint, which could be connecting to the line of business database, which could be pulling from a cloud service, completely transparent to that user. Then, on top of it all, they can take it offline. So Office and that people-centric type of a model allows for offline experiences as it relates to managing information and data. Moving forward, you get into collaborative applications. That's really getting at SharePoint's core, providing this business collaboration platform, the ability to share information across organizations, across users, across enterprises. Okay, so we've now got into deployment models and solution architectures that require us to federate with other organizations, other environments. SharePoint, in SharePoint 2007, we have the ability of making SharePoint claims aware. So you have environments now where you can enable SharePoint to accept claims. Again, these are industry standard things that we're talking about here. Now SharePoint affords you the opportunity through the architecture upon which it's been designed and built to enable those types of scenarios. Moving into 2010, we build even more capabilities for allowing that federation to happen and the collaboration to occur across organizations. In addition to that, when we talked about the cloud earlier, imagine a scenario now you have a SharePoint document library, and I'm talking about this because this is something that I'm building and I'll be posting at some point here in the near future. The ability of checking in and checking out documents in a document library. But unbeknownst to the user, the documents themselves are not living in a SharePoint content database. It's sitting in the cloud. And my example will be sitting in Windows Azure Storage, our cloud computing platform. But now you're checking in and checking out documents. But now you've scaled your storage infrastructure infinitely, because now those documents are stored external from your organization in a secure, highly scalable, highly available information store. But you're keeping users in tools in which they're most familiar, so they still have the same semantics of check-in, check-out, document-level security, all the capabilities that I showed you in that previous slide that I didn't have to write a single line of code for. I just take advantage of because it's a part of my development platform. And those are the types of capabilities that are being afforded from SharePoint today and are going to be enhanced in SharePoint 2010 tomorrow. And then lastly, composite applications. I mentioned this, and I'll beat this horse to death, as it relates to SharePoint as an aggregation platform, basically tying in key information, key data from multiple disparate data sources, and providing the ability for you to have that one unifying executive dashboard that reaches out to the world. That's a key component of SharePoint, and that's something that we're enhancing moving into the 2010 timeframe. So I've talked a whole lot about, building blocks and a number of scenarios. SharePoint provides a lot of capabilities out of the box, from portals, from wikis, discussion forums, workflow, InfoPath form services, the ability to publish up forms in an e-form scenario, enterprise search, the ability to create dashboards, the web part framework, which, by and large, SharePoint influenced the web part framework that sits in ASP.NET today. If you remember back in the SharePoint Portal Server 2003 timeframe, when we originally introduced web parts, immediately the developer community jumped around and said, hey, how do I build that into my ASP.NET application? Well, the product team responded and said, hey, this is a cool enough technology that we'll build it into the core platform. But the plus side about that is that when you implement those types of web part features in your custom application, they easily migrate over to SharePoint. So we've basically kept that parity between the capabilities that we're delivering in SharePoint to what you can currently do in a development platform if you're just developing in pure ASP.NET. It's going to improve over time. We're constantly making enhancements to that. But again, we're talking about developer technologies. The technology that you're using to build your custom ASP.NET applications today, we're shipping product on top of those same technologies. A number of scenarios I've talked about already as it relates to information worker, being able to share information, process documents, a lot of business systems integration, human workflow. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Reporting and analysis, the BI capability from a SharePoint perspective. You're getting a lot of that in the box today, and we're building on that, continuing in the 2010 timeframe, and the ability to deliver internet sites. And so here's a number of examples of the types of application scenarios that are now afforded to you without a whole lot of code. So a lot of these capabilities are built in such a way that you really take advantage of a lot of capabilities that are really afforded to you out of the box in SharePoint. So one of the other premises behind SharePoint is really to have you not write a lot of code, to really take advantage of a lot of capabilities and a lot of engineering that's going into the product. So you can focus more on that maybe 10% or 15% that SharePoint doesn't do and really add additional business value to your organization. But leaving all the heavy lifting for a lot of the other stuff that you would typically have to do in a web development project, say in SharePoint, a lot of that's taken care of for you. Workflow. One of the key components from a SharePoint Server 2007 perspective. When we introduced workflow, it became the rage as it relates to SharePoint. It was something that people have tried many times before to implement in previous versions of SharePoint. I like to put myself in that particular example. When I first got it started in the blogging, blogosphere, some of my first series of posts, and a couple of you guys who probably have followed it could probably attest to, I talked about, it was a multi-part series about building an XML-based workflow engine and hosting it inside of SharePoint. At the time, SharePoint Portal Server 2003. And I got a tremendous number of hits, a number of questions. How do you go about doing it? Well, I also got pinged by folks at the product team inside of Red saying, hey, we're building that type of capability in the next version of the product. And so, it's something that, I make that example to say, Microsoft is listening. The product team is listening. Although it may not seem that way sometimes. I'll take my Microsoft hat off and be the first to say, because I've sat in that chair, I've argued with some of you folks in the audience. I've agreed with many of the folks in the audience on various capabilities that exist or don't exist in the platform. But I will say that we've made tremendous strides in trying to deliver capability that you can then take advantage of and deliver very robust, compelling services to your organization. Workflow being one of them. Workflow in 2007 gives you the ability for building these ad hoc human-oriented workflow. It's built on top of a developer technology we call Windows Workflow Foundation. And in addition to the fact that you have that workflow engine hosted in SharePoint, you have a development experience whereby you can develop custom workflows either utilizing the workflow designer that's available in SharePoint Designer or using the workflow designer that's available in Visual Studio. So now you have the ability of building workflows outside of SharePoint. You can have them run, let's say, within your custom ASP.NET application, or have that same workflow hosted inside of SharePoint. So again, it's really trying to bridge the gap as it relates to what we currently do from a custom development perspective to what's available out of the box via SharePoint perspective. Integrated with line of business systems. We introduced a capability in the 2007 timeframe called the BDC, or the Business Data Council. Provides you the ability of connecting to a third-party relational data store, be it SQL Server, be it Oracle, be it DB2, or allow you to connect to some application via web services endpoint. And this is a capability that we're enhancing in the 2010 timeframe. One of the biggest knocks in 2007 was that the BDC was only one way. You can only basically query information out of a data store and have it displayed inside of your application. In the 2010 timeframe, it's bi-directional. So you now have the ability of actually putting information inside of these other stores. And again, there's not a lot of code that needs to be written in order to make this happen. You're talking about creating an application definition in the 2007 timeframe that's utilizing what's called the BDC editor, which is a GUI that allows you to create these types of packages. Or the capability is woven into Visual Studio. So in 2010, so you have the ability in the 2010 timeframe to work with this inside of the context of Visual Studio. So you have a lot of capabilities that's made available to you. And even in the 2007 timeframe, where the BDC is still unidirectional, unidirectional, you still have a lot of value to be gained even from that type of scenario. So, for example, you can tie in the BDC to enterprise search. So now, when you initialize a search, not only are you searching across content that's sitting in your document or content database, but you can also query and search information that may be sitting in a relational store. That may not necessarily be sitting inside of your organization. Okay? You have that information tied back into a typical search result and the ability to tie a custom action to that search result so that if I do pull a result from a line of business system, I can tie in an action that basically says, for this particular record, take me over to that line of business application and take me directly to that record that I can then update or do whatever I need to do with it. So again, you've got scenarios here from a development platform perspective. Again, not a lot of code needs to be written in order to enable this capability with the current product today. And then it's going to be built on or improved in the 2010 timeframe to allow even more flexibility for being able to tie in that line of business data. Moving to a paperless environment. How many folks here, by show of hands, want to get away from pushing paper documents within the organization? How many folks are tired of seeing their business users, print out documents, shipping them around, constantly getting lost, having to then, pulling from, some backup and what have you? People are getting tired of it. People want to move. The government in general wants to move away from paper and move more to electronic forms. Well, you have a forms package built out of the box, delivered via SharePoint 2007. It's called InfoPath Form Service. So you now have the ability then of creating your electronic forms in a client environment, that being InfoPath, publishing it up to SharePoint, and then having people who may not necessarily have InfoPath installed now have the ability of viewing forms and filling out forms over the web through the standard browser, giving full parity to what you currently get in the client side or the rich client platform in terms of field validation, because again, everything is controlled via an XML scheme. So you have all of that capability that you would typically get in the InfoPath TIC client, but you now have that infrastructure available to you over the web. So what you're looking at now is sort of a high-level architectural diagram, if you will, of the various layers that would sit inside of an InfoPath Form Services infrastructure, complete with the tools and metadata that you can capture about that form, and all of that sits inside of SharePoint. So again, you're not stepping out and introducing a lot of capability that require you to procure other hardware, procure other applications to deliver that capability. You have that all bundled in with the SharePoint platform. What does an architecture look like? Classic example, you have an externally facing portal, could be sitting in your DMV, could be something part of your extranet environment that's providing access to those forms. Think of an example of someone going in and filling out the driver's license or renewing a driver's license or applying for a fishing license, let's say. They're accessing through a secure portal exposed to the internet. They fill out their form, InfoPath form that's controlled from a business user. So the business user is basically the orchestrator of this entire process. They create the form, they create the validation rules, they could tie in other data sources that they need to pull information from in order to populate form fields, and then they publish it up to SharePoint. SharePoint visualizes that in the form of a web-based HTML client form that's displayed via the browser. They fill out the information, they submit it. That form can be submitted over standard HTTP SOAP to a receiving web service. A web service, by the way, that can be hosted in SharePoint, or it could be pointing directly to a document library. You have the full flexibility of being able to do that. And then you have your internal workflow, where you have individuals that can work on that submitted form on the behalf of the submitter, that being the citizen that sits outside of the organization. In addition to that, you have even more scenario, or even more flexibility in that form that was submitted from a programmatic sense, because of the capabilities that's provided from a SharePoint perspective. When that incoming form hits the document library, you can dynamically switch out the template. So let's say you have a pared-down template that external citizens use, but you have something more elaborate and advanced that your internal users use. And the internal users may be using the InfoPath TIC client. Well, from that perspective, you now have the ability of changing the user experience and tailoring it to the user audience. So now I have my internal client that could have a custom task pane, that may be going out and querying some third-party web service, that may be displaying some dynamic information via Windows Presentation Foundation, basically doing whatever in your heart's content, but still working in the confines of what's been defined by that schema-enforced XML form. Now, that particular example, I've done it. I've written it. Did it in an hour. It's that type of capability, and not a lot of code, not a lot of lines of code to deliver that type of capability. Again, the core value, the key messaging here is SharePoint is truly just an application development platform. It's not anything monstrous. It's not this icky thing You got to figure out how to integrate into your environment. It'll honor whatever requirements that you've defined in your organization. It'll honor whatever security policies you have in place. It doesn't impose anything. You basically tell it what it needs to do. You tell it what security apples it needs to honor, and it will do that. And then at the same time, provide you all of the development capability that I've talked about up to this point. BI. I talked about BI earlier. I mean, this is what you're getting in the box from a SharePoint perspective. All up. You have, obviously built on a rich platform SQL Server. Again, this is SQL Server that, it's not tied into SharePoint. It's not, something that you can't modify, you can't extend. We're talking about SQL Server, something that you have your own custom applications running on top of. All of that capability rolls directly up into the SharePoint platform. There's another capability that we've introduced on top of the SharePoint platform, product by the name of Performance Point, which provides you even more robust dashboarding, scorecarding capability, and gets you really into that business insight area that Jay alluded to in the keynote. We're really digging deep into the core KPIs in your organization and provide this robust reporting, dashboarding interface for bubbling that information out. There's still investments in Excel. Excel probably will be the default BI tool for the rest of our lives. It has become that popular. So we've seen that, we've embraced that, we've introduced capabilities through Excel services that allow you to even take further advantage of Excel. So imagine a scenario where you have an Excel file, a workbook, now sitting inside of Excel services. Now, let's say, for example, you have an Excel workbook that's been evolving over a number of years and has a lot of cool functions that do, some business-level calculations that you would love to be able to reuse inside of your web application. Through Excel services, that Excel workbook has now been being exposed as a programmable component. So you can now program that workbook as if it's an object that you instantiate inside of a custom application. So that function that I talked about earlier now becomes a method. And you can pass in value, it'll perform the calculation on your behalf, and give you back the result. So now we avoid having to do what we traditionally had to do, and that is instantiate Excel on the server, programmatically load in the workbook, go through a very arcane object model for pulling information out of or getting information into, to a services-based model that has an infinite level of scale. Enterprise search. I talked about search earlier, and I'm really in awe of how folks have looked at SharePoint and have not really seen search as a viable development platform. Search basically helps transcend a number of different issues as it relates to SharePoint. For example, I can't count how many times I've seen folks building out, a navigational tree structure, iterating over the SharePoint object model, which unfortunately has a performance side effect because every time you iterate over an object in a SharePoint object model, it goes and creates another connection to the SQL Server database because it's putting that information out. Well, imagine now utilizing the SharePoint search, enterprise search web service to do one query over that site structure. You then get back a strongly typed object that has all of the sites, the sub-sites, the sub-sub-sites that sit inside of that organization through one query, and now you can iterate over that object and build out your tree without having to incur that performance hit. So that's an example of taking advantage of key capabilities that you would typically look at as just an end-user capability, where there's development capabilities behind that particular environment as well. And through enterprise search, you can afford a number of different options or a number of different opportunities to really build key business value without really writing a whole lot of code and enduring a lot of pain for having to debug that type of infrastructure. From a development perspective, you have, a number of different options. The tools that you choose, primarily based on the role that you take within the course of a project. From a no-code, end-user development perspective, you can provide capabilities in the standard browser using SharePoint out-of-the-box interface. The ability to go in and provision out a website for building or adding a web part to a web part page, for linking in search, things of that nature. A lot of that capability can be handled out of the box via the browser. No code. Go one level up. You can take more a declarative approach, leveraging SharePoint Designer tools like SharePoint Designer, tools like InfoPath for creating forms and publishing it up to a SharePoint store, or even Access. Access today, a lot of people sort of make the argument, well, where does Access fit into the larger model? Access today can be very well used as a front end to SharePoint. It provides a lot of capability from a relational querying capability for being able to build, a forms-based UI on top of SharePoint data that you can take advantage of. In the 2010 time frame, with Office 2010 and SharePoint 2010, we want to be enhanced even more. Moving up to more sophisticated use, that's where you get into the heavy-hitting tools like Visual Studio. And bar none, Visual Studio is the best development platform for building capabilities on top of SharePoint. The community supports it. There's a number of community components that exist, a bunch of tools that have been built that integrate into SharePoint. Into Visual Studio. There are command line tools that can fit inside a Team Foundation server and be passed via MS Build or all the ALM capabilities for facilitating those test-driven development type of scenarios or those continuous integration type of scenarios. There's a groundswell of community support in support of Visual Studio in developing solutions on top of SharePoint. And we've really just scratched the surface. There's going to be more capabilities in the 2010 timeframe and beyond that you'll be able to take advantage of. And speaking of tools, you have a number of tools at your disposal. Now, this slide is slightly modified just for this talk, but I typically list technologies in the order in which they should be installed when you're building out a typical development environment in SharePoint. Here, I just want to show and step back, another 50,000 feet, and just to show you the number of tools that you have at your disposal, out of the box from a Microsoft perspective. But this is not the be-all and end-all. There are tons, and literally tons of tools, both from what Microsoft internal field folks have developed and published out to the community, our SharePoint MVP, a most valuable professional community at large, and just people who have just encountered a particular challenge in SharePoint and have tried to address and made community code available for your consumption. There was a question asked earlier about being able to deploy remotely on SharePoint or debug remotely on SharePoint. Well, there are community projects that are starting to address that type of a challenge. One of the big challenges that we face right now is the fact that we have to bound Visual Studio and SharePoint on the development workstation. Well, I happen to know good friend and partner of ours has built a solution, hosted the Codeplex, that allow you to remotely deploy WSP. So now you don't necessarily have to have SharePoint installed on your workstation. And this is currently shipping SharePoint today. So there is value to be gained from the community. And that's one thing that really makes SharePoint really pop as it relates to application development, and that is the groundswell of community support that exists with the platform. Bringing it all together. So I put these slides together to really just talk about at a high level things you need to consider as it relates to building out a development environment for SharePoint. In 2007, a Windows Server OS is typically required, and there's a number of options that you can accomplish this. You can either install the host, the OS itself on bare metal, which a lot of public tech organizations, that's a very sore spot in terms of being able to install a full-blown server OS on bare metal hardware, either via agency policies or IT support, or just flat out we're not going to allow you to do it. But there's other options. You can leverage virtualization software, Virtual PC or Windows Virtual PC, which is our new version of Virtual PC technology. There's Virtual Server 2005 R2. There's competing products like VMware. There's Hypervisor or Hyper-V, which is a Windows Server 2008 technology that we provide. And then there's open source solutions like VirtualBox. Now, I will say in a 2010 time frame, from a virtualization perspective, 2010 is only supported on x64-based kits. So that sort of narrows down the virtualization options that you have. From a Microsoft perspective, that would be Hyper-V, and then from competing would be VMware, Workstation, or VirtualBox, which is an open source solution. And then there's another compelling solution, which is that we've introduced in Windows 7, called Boot to VHD. So I can basically define a virtual machine instance and boot into it as if it's a real OS image that's been installed on my local hard drive. That gives me a number of flexible types of scenarios that I can address. In my environment, I typically run Windows 7. I boot into a Windows Server 2008 R2 VM that's been enabled with Hyper-V. So I'm basically running virtual machines inside of a virtual machine, because even my host environment is a VHD that I boot into at start. So that a little complicated ways of being able to do dual boot in an environment, well, Windows 7 really eliminates that responsibility. In SharePoint 2010, as Jay alluded to in the keynote, will now allow you to install the core server bits via SharePoint Foundation, which provides you with the Rust environment, or the all-up enterprise-level SharePoint 2010 SKU on a Windows client OS, Windows Vista or Windows 7 x64. There's a requirement there for 64-bit, x64 environment. Team development. I would be remiss if I did not include a slide paying homage to my tools guide around team development, and thou shalt always use source control. Having a key source control strategy as it relates to SharePoint is really key to the success of a development project. Having established ALM process is very key as it relates to the full SDLC, as it relates to developing and deploying functionality for a SharePoint environment. Having solid unit test strategy in place. We do support various unit testing frameworks that are in the market today. You can also take advantage of mocking frameworks like TypeMock, Isolator, and a lot of other mocking frameworks to do some of the more TDD-oriented things as it relates to SharePoint development. We've produced guidance through our SharePoint Patterns and Practices team on how to do that level of development utilizing SharePoint and various tools in the community. So this is something that we're embracing as it relates to SharePoint and the evolution of that development. From a team development perspective, there's a few options as it relates to your environment. One, obviously working in an individual development environment and publishing to a centralized dev test integration server. This typically allows for the most flexibility because you have all the tools installed. You have your VMs running on your local machine, or in the 2010 timeframe, you have the bits installed on your bare metal OS. And then once you've developed and tested your capabilities, your functionality locally, you then publish that out to some dev test integration server. Very flexible, but does require a little bit more discipline as it relates to your development process. And that's where ALM tools really come into play. Option D, working on a centralized development server, be it physical or virtual. So you can use virtual servers to host your external dev test integration environments. With developer workstations running Visual Studio and the SharePoint object model. In this case, Microsoft.SharePoint Assembly. Not really flexible. Does give you the ability to program against the object model locally. In the 2010 time frame, this model is really not a good one to implement, but in 2007, for those who have restrictions as it relates to what can or can't be installed from developer workstation, but they still want to accomplish, at least to some degree, the ability to develop locally, you have the ability of developing against the object model and all the functionality that you need to develop out, and then publish that up to an environment that's running full-blown SharePoint. Option C, working directly on a centralized development server, be it physical or virtual, via RDP type of environments. Again, for small development teams, this is probably a good medium between the other two options. However, it does introduce a little bit of limitations as it relates to the number of concurrent connections you can have if you're using remote desktops. So those are challenges that you have to face as it relates to if you have larger teams that want to take advantage of this. The key advantage in this type of scenario is that you have everything installed on some remote machine and people are connecting to it from a thin client type of environment. SharePoint on the web. I've talked about SharePoint in the enterprise. I've talked about it from a work group perspective, departmental. So we all have a good grounding as it relates to SharePoint and the types of capabilities they can deliver in the enterprise. But one of the things that we're starting to see in the market is now SharePoint being positioned as a platform for delivering very compelling, robust, scalable, internet website-based infrastructure. Okay, this is a very hot market from a Microsoft perspective because we're starting to really put traction around leveraging SharePoint in this particular type of deployment environment. In 2010, A lot of the capabilities that you see, we're really stealing. Okay, we're borrowing, or we're partnering, good word, partnering with some of the standard social networking sites you're seeing over the web today. We're bringing in and utilizing the ideas that have grown around those communities like the Facebook, like the MySpace, LinkedIn, what have you, and building that capability into the platform. So now you have a social networking type of capability that you can take advantage of, either delivering through your own public website or delivering that capability internally within your environment. You can kind of simulate some of that functionality even in 2007 today, building around the concept of the SharePoint My Site and the ability of creating these knowledge networks for tying in having an expertise finder. You can do that via the people search capability that's available in 2007. You can aggregate content that's coming from external blogs and wikis and what have you. You can have all that in 2007 today, and we extend that capability in 2010. From a SharePoint perspective, as it relates to development capabilities, you have the ability of leveraging the out-of-the-box or building your own page publishing workflows. So for how content is created, published, and approved and published in your environment, you have complete control over the orchestration of that. You have robust caching architecture. From a 2007 perspective, we're leveraging heavily the ASP.NET caching model. In 2010, we build on that and build new caching infrastructure to really position SharePoint as a very robust, scalable infrastructure for hosting even the most demanding of websites. Automated content deployment, we've all seen our pain with content deployment. So I'm not going to sit here and say the content deployment is great in 2007. Some of the projects that I'll talk about have experienced some challenges with content deployment, but it's getting fixed, and it's getting better to a point where we're going to have a really robust way of being able to publish out content in a very automated way from a dev testing environment to a staging environment and ultimately to a production environment. These are investments that we're taking the lumps on the head, but we're also working with partners who are doing this stuff in the wild, figuring out the challenges that they're running into, and building that, communicating that back to the product team, and building it into the core platform. And I've talked about Web 2.0 capabilities, blogs, wikis, discussion forums, and then there are a number of capabilities that we're introducing that are being contributed by the community. Our community kit for SharePoint, which is available on CodePlex, has capabilities for integrating Windows Live ID, more enhanced templates for blogs and wikis. And in the 2010 timeframe, we're building on top of that. We're building on top of that even more. So we're really trying to take SharePoint to the next level and addressing a number of new deployment scenarios as it relates to SharePoint on the public web. I talked a little bit about sites that are near and dear to my heart. Well, here's a few examples of sites that are running on top of SharePoint, but they don't look like SharePoint. Then one of the other key capabilities or key advantages as it relates to SharePoint, and also tears down a little bit of a misnomer about SharePoint and the ability to be customized, is that you have the ability to customize SharePoint to mimic the look and feel of whatever you want it to look like. Okay? It's built on top of the same paging, theming, page layout model that ASP.NET introduced through master pages. It's introduced an even more robust layout capabilities for page layout, so you can define very unique layouts for how your pages look. That could tie into a number of different social networking capabilities. You want to tie that in. So what you're looking at now is an example of a production level site, a company by the name of Conservation International. We worked with them to deliver a publicly facing internet presence in support of the Live Earth concert that happened about 2 years ago. The Conservation International was one of our major content providers from our Live Earth website, from liveearth.msn.com. And we worked with them to basically upgrade their website infrastructure to take advantage of SharePoint and deliver robust capabilities, because by and large, when people would click through content that was sitting on our MSN property, they would drill down and ultimately get to capability content that was provided by Conservation International. Very dynamic website, also integrates with a third-party CRM product, cloud-based product. So again, that's really the showcase and the testament of being able to integrate SharePoint very seamlessly to other externally facing cloud services. So you're delivering key business value and delivering compelling UI through a solution platform, a unifying solution platform. Library of Congress, myllc.gov. This is a project, and again, from a Conservation International, there were more around, trying to generate awareness around preservation of Earth's natural heritage, really getting into, conserving natural resources and what have you. Library of Congress is really around disseminating information, basically opening up history, trying to get more excitement and more interest back into American history. MyLC.gov is a component of that project that they deliver, that delivers a very compelling user experience and really defines how you navigate American history. It also has Silverlight integration. So this is a particular application that leverages rich internet applications hosted on a SharePoint infrastructure. Again, this doesn't look like SharePoint, but it's SharePoint on the web. It's been architected for a highly available, highly scalable environment that you can now take advantage of and basically experience American history. Now, the plus side about this, or an additional component of this, is not only is this site publicly available that users can access, but we also take advantage of the application infrastructure because this site also acts as a back-end content management repository for kiosks that are written in WPF that are running on-site in the Thomas Jefferson Building in D.C. So you can go and interact with a lot of the interactions that you experience on the website. You can actually walk up to them in a kiosk and start touching and interacting with those environments. And the content that is served up to those environments are being served from this infrastructure. So again, we're talking about reusing SharePoint in a number of different ways to deliver web capability as well as enterprise capability through one deployment. Outstanding. And lastly, most recently, the relaunch of the recovery.gov website. Complete SharePoint infrastructure. Again, this site does not look like SharePoint, but I have the ability of taking advantage of all of the capabilities from an enterprise search perspective, from web pages. I have Flash and Silverlight, all that integrated into this site,
including integration or future integrations of services from Bing, in terms of Bing search, a lot of capabilities, all at my disposal for a very robust application infrastructure. So again, the key messages I want to leave with you as it relates to SharePoint on the web is that SharePoint is here. And again, these are not 2010 sites. This is SharePoint Server 2007. So the key message I want to leave with you is that SharePoint is ready and positioned for the web. And if you're thinking about doing a migration or figuring out what your strategy long-term is from a web content management perspective, and you're looking at what are some platforms that you can start standardizing on, why not take a look at SharePoint? Because it does provide you a ton of capability out of the box that allow you to give these types of scenarios, but at the same time have a developer platform that you can further extend and deliver capabilities either via your public constituents or your internal users. And with that, I'm done.
Thanks, Lamont. Any questions for Lamont? Oh, lunch. Okay, we're right up at lunchtime, so let's take about 3 questions if we can, and then we'll break for lunch. And everyone will be floating around here as well if you want to grab them for other questions.
So the question was, from a content migration perspective, I talked earlier about the lumps that we've taken over the head as it relates to content deployment in 07. And the question was, what is going to be the strategy for migrating content from 2007 to 2010? And if the tooling support that we provided in 2007 or the migration from 03 to 07 is still the same, or has it improved? Is that a good summation of the question? So as it relates to content deployment and management and migrating content from 07 and 2010, we've taken great pains in preserving all the investments that you've made in a 2007 perspective and having it just work in a 2010. So basically you're following some of the similar mechanisms for migrating 03 to 07, where you can do a direct DB detach and attach to a SharePoint 2010 instance. So you can basically detach a SharePoint 2007 content database to a SharePoint 2010 content database. And as a part of that migration, SharePoint 2010 will automatically upgrade that database, not necessarily modifying any of the content, but upgrade the content and the configuration databases so that it works in 2010. It just works. Web parts will still be more of a manual migration. As it relates to, you have 4 components that are deployed in the GAC. We're not going to take a backup of that and deploy that over. So So you're still reverting to, migrating your web parts over. But from a back compatibility perspective, basically anything that you've developed as it relates to SharePoint 2007, which includes your page templates, your features, especially if you're doing things like feature stapling or what have you, and those complex site definitions, all of that will migrate over pretty much by default in SharePoint 2010. I mean, think of SharePoint 2010 as really a polishing release to 2007. It adds a number of different capabilities from a 2007, from a .NET framework perspective. But in terms of the core functionality, a lot of it will basically work as advertised in 2010. Did that answer the question? All right. Next question. I think he might have had you speak.
Is Microsoft going to address the issue of moving your SharePoint design and workflows from development to maybe production?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
When you do a workflow using SharePoint Designer, sometimes you have to recreate in your production machine. There is no easy way of, moving your workflow, developing SharePoint Designer from development to production.
So the question, or the question / comment for me is that there have been challenges in terms of workflows that have been created in SharePoint Designer. And in terms of being able to deploy those to production SharePoint instances. So workflows you develop, let's say, in the development environment using SharePoint Designer, there's been issues in deploying those same workflows in a production environment. Quite honestly, I have not run into that challenge. I will say that in SharePoint Designer and the workflows made some enhancements from a workflow perspective. We also provide the source of the out-of-the-box workflows that have been previously, sort of locked up, if you will, so you can, extend and create, your variations of the things that we ship out of the box. From a deployment perspective, as it relates to SharePoint Designer, there's been a lot of focus around making SharePoint Designer sort of the de facto administration tool from a higher-level power user perspective of a SharePoint deployment. So I would venture to say that you probably addressed the challenges that you've run into, and that to take a look at SharePoint 2010. You'll have my contact information. We can talk offline if there's some specific issue that I'll be able to help you with. But I've never run into that yet. Any more questions? One more question?
All right, one more question.
How much you can use the SQL Server tables, lookup tables, and the cross tables into the SharePoint? If I don't want to use the SharePoint internal database, I want directly to point, like if I have a user table, the roles table, and cross-reference table, then on that table, if you want to restrict some of the things in SharePoint, can you do that?
So the question is, can I basically point SharePoint to an external store that's outside of the SharePoint database for basically being able to manage users and accounts information, or maybe not even using Active Directory. I want to use some other authoritative source of user information. The answer to that question is yes, you can do that in SharePoint 2007 today. So we've introduced architecture in 2007 around the ASP.NET provider pattern, and we call these authentication providers. And so what authentication providers allow you to do is point to some other authoritative source. It could be a SQL data store, could be some other third-party LDAP store. In the case of Conservation International, I mentioned earlier, they're utilizing the hosted CRM solution as account for their account information. You use Windows Live ID. So these authentication providers provide the flexibility mechanism that allow you to hook into other authoritative sources for user information, but still use the security semantics of being able to determine what they can and can't see. So basically, it's using that authentication store and authorization store to basically determine that they have access. But then inside of SharePoint, you can still control what they can and can't see based off of the credentials that are given back to us from that third-party store. So you can do that in 2007 today, and you can definitely do it in 2010.
All right. Great. Thanks, Lamont. Appreciate it. Like I said, well done sitting around. Great session. Thank you. One quick announcement on lunch. We do have lunch provided. Since this is a mixed event between commercial and government employees, essentially what we've done is we're asking for anybody who is working for a government employee, working for government or as a contractor for government, that you do provide a cash donation for your lunch. You'll see the sign there, and you can do that to Julie, the person who registered you. If you didn't want to do that, there's lots of options around here, subway type things right down across the street in the mall. So appreciate your compliance with that, and we'll get started again at 12:30 in the afternoon.